So we're live now, and I'm gonna fix this. All right. So thanks for sticking around, everyone who stayed. Hey, I'm trying to think of what's significant about what we saw. The human robots, and that's how we have a photo of the elephant's foot. I don't think we saw the elephant foot. We got the German robot in there, and circuits got fried. We had this problem in Japan, in Fukushima Daiichi, and it took a while. And I don't know how much you followed after you left, Reid, but they did eventually get a robot to operate, an aquatic robot, as well as a kind of a scan through the corium to find out exactly where it is. They a muon scan, I think that's what it is. So they had a muon detector, and they aren't generating these. These come from outer space, and we're able to see the shadow of the corium. I think that's, if anyone has any better information, but that's the last that I read about on that. And so the human robot's going in and moving, and the soldier with the tear on his boot, the implication is that he's going to suffer a contamination, some kind of a cancer, but they don't exactly spell that out in the show. And I think, as far as we know, there were not a great number of deaths after the initial firefighters who suffered burns and the firefighters who did not decontaminate after their first response. So there's a little bit of not being appropriately prepared for that disaster, not having the right process, and we had something similar in Fukushima where we understood it. Reid, if you want to speak a little bit on this. Oh, you're on. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Right in the light, we're on live. So
that's great. I'm not sure I'm going to handle it. All right. One of the concerns I have with this movie, I think it's a really interesting and well done movie in some respects. But I think what they're really trying to do here is they're trying to tug at our emotions on a couple of these factors. And I'm going to walk it backwards just a little bit. One of the things about being contaminated and having this radiation affect you is, as Carl pointed out, there's different kinds of radiation. And some of the things that they're exposed to, most of the high radiation they're being exposed to are gamma rays, which are essentially like X-rays, similar except higher energy. And they do go through the material and go through your body. And as it passes through your body, there's a little bit of ionization going on, that's the term. And those ionizations could be harmful, and they could burn you, they could actually kill you, as they've shown in the movie. But once they pass through you, you're not radioactive. You yourself are not radioactive. Now, the way you could become radioactive are two ways. So the first way is if you get bombarded by a bunch of neutrons. And we saw that in some accidents in the early part of history, including the atomic weapon. So when you get hit by a neutron, your body can activate and become radioactive. Right? Well, that didn't happen here. There was no neutron explosion. In fact, I have a question. Carl sort of alluded to it. You see it in the movie sometimes when they talk about the explosion. The explosion was not a nuclear explosion. I hope we understand that just from the movie. It wasn't nuclear. It was a steam explosion from the great amount of heat and the water, okay? So, and it takes a completely different kind of set of dynamics to make it a nuclear explosion, which in most reactors you can't get there, basically.
Well, we did get to the positive void coefficient issue.
Right.
And I think there's some estimates. There's a great contributor to the Nuke Nerd on Facebook, and he said the worst that it could have been was a 1.02 prompt critical reaction. And so if that's possible, I sort of went back and forth with him to sort of like guess, well, what is the difference here between a bomb and a nuclear power plant? And the answer that we sort of came together on was, if you're at a 1.4 reactivity rate, then it sort of the equation, that equation of prompt criticality breaks down and you're dealing with other factors. And so it's like, so it's sort of like that's when you hit the bomb level of a prompt criticality, where most of the matter is instantly fissioned or in the wake. And so this was far below this, hundreds of thousands of times below the reactivity rate at the worst. But you are right, and the best science we know is that it was the steam that blew the top off that reactor.
Right. I mean, if it was actually a nuclear detonation, it would be a far different scene, far different. So we all know that there's a difference, and they weren't even close to that. So one of the things that I told you how you can get radiated. And the other way you can get irradiated is if you consume a lot of this contamination. And much of these products that you hear about on the news are things like cesium and strontium and plutonium, things like that are radioactive isotopes that were distributed across the ground that you could say got sprinkled everywhere. We saw that same kind of thing in Fukushima. Now, if you were to consume that and then your body got into your body and it sort of situated itself and concentrated, then yes, then you got a higher level of contamination in your body. But what you do with a person that gets contaminated is you wash it off. You wash it. You wash it all away. You cut their hair out because the hair could absorb some of it. You put them in a shower. You take all their clothes off, first of all, because it's the clothes that really protect you. And then they're not radioactive. So this whole idea that young lady, the fireman's wife, when they said don't touch them, you don't want to touch them because they're burned. If you have a burn victim, you don't touch them either, right? I mean, seriously, they had serious skin burns. You could look at that. So many of the firemen suffered from two things. They suffered from high radiation damage, and they suffered from heat damage. And so, yes, and anytime somebody's in the hospital like that, you don't go in there and hug them. You don't touch them. You wouldn't want to do that anyway because it's harmful to the victim, not to themselves. And so there was no risk at all for that young lady to get irradiated. And so I think they put the thread through it as if somehow her baby got irradiated then, which is completely ridiculous in my opinion.
That seems like a really weird thing to put in there. Did that seem scientifically sound at all?
No, unless somehow she was drinking his body fluids and he somehow got it all. But see, it doesn't make any sense.
Well, wouldn't the radiation come from being in the general area? Like, she was in Pripyat, right? Which wasn't Pripyat evacuated?
Yes. Okay, so now, you're right. So it had nothing to do with her husband, but they try to make that tie-in as if it was with her husband that she got irradiated. Now, did the whole population get sprinkled? The answer is yes. Lots of Europe got sprinkled. So there is contamination and radiation throughout the world from Chernobyl, and it just distributed itself across Scandinavia mostly. But that's in that direction. So everybody got a certain level of contamination, but they've done plenty of studies and went back and looked at it. And I think Carl already addressed this. Much of that human effect that we saw was the iodine in children, in the uptake. I think Chris mentioned that, right? So there's a lot of uptake into the thyroid glands of children who ended up having thyroid defects. Some of it was cancer. The other thing we ought to know about thyroid cancer is it's mostly survivable. I mean, in the Western countries, it's like 95% survivable with thyroid cancer. So it's not like fatality just because you get thyroid cancer, and just because you have iodine, radioactive iodine in your thyroid doesn't mean you're going to get that either. So that's a kind of a scary thought when people think about it. Oh my God, you're going to get iodine. Oh my God, you're going to get thyroid cancer. But it would suck, I would guess, but it would not necessarily be, fatal. Yeah.
Contamination. One of the ancillary stories from the Chernobyl accident is that northern Scandinavia got busted with material from the continent, right? And the Sami people live on a diet of reindeer up there. There's this idea that radioactive material settled across the countryside, and that was taken up by plants that were then eaten by the reindeer that provide the basis of the Sami people's And I've heard this quoted a couple of times by friends of mine in the environmental community, talking about climate change and also the sympathetic concerns about people living in the far north, Native people especially. And a friend of mine cited this. He's like, oh, and on top of it, they're all suffering from the fallout of the Chernobyl accident, because they're dying. And I was really curious if you had any comment on that, or like these generations of uptake like that, if it goes from plant to animal to human consumption. What is that? What's the long-lasting effect of that process?
That's an excellent question. When we were looking at the food chain after the Fukushima accident, it started me. Actually, I was not trained in any of this health physicist stuff.
I mean, I understand you have to built out immediately, right? And you don't do things immediately, but at some point, like, what is this generational uptake?
So to get to your point, there is that cesium is the primary cause, but there is that cesium uptake, and cesium is a lot like sodium potassium, right? It's a single ionization. So if you took cesium chloride, it would look a lot like sodium chloride, which is what you see on table salt. So the body itself takes in cesium much like it would. Or did I get that wrong? Is it +2? Is it +1? I think it's +1. Anyway, it's much like the salt that you'd find in your body, and so therefore the salts in your body tend to concentrate in the muscles. And so anyone that's exposed to a lot of cesium, you'll see the concentration primarily occur in the muscles. And that's the same thing with animals. So if you have a lot of cesium, it'll get into the animals, it'll get into their muscle tissue. If you eat those muscle tissues, you'll consume it. That doesn't necessarily mean your body's going to absorb it, but it'll absorb a little, and it'll go through your body, and it'll get in those same places. But I think what we found, plenty of studies have shown that, yes, even though it's in that cycle, it's at such a low level. It's detectable now, maybe that we didn't have that before, but it's at such a low level that I think the experts have already shown that there are no mal effects from any of that, from any of it.
That was my impression, and I just was not understanding.
Yeah, I think that one of the things to note is the two different cesium radioisotopes, 134 and 137. And Jay Cullen, one of the universities in Canada, does a really good program called Fukushima Inform. In this program, he educates folks about the effects of radiation, how much radiation happened because of Fukushima, and in part he used 134 as the tracer to determine whether the sample came from Fukushima or not, because there is so much 137 still in the environment. And I think something like 90% of the cesium contamination that was released in the atmosphere came from atomic weapons testing.
Yeah, not Chernobyl.
No.
Atomic weapons testing.
Yeah. Chernobyl was a significant amount, but after the 134 fell off, we're left with the same, the legacy of 137.
Yeah, cesium-134 has a 2-year half-life, and so as Chris explained earlier, as you get through the half-lives, it decays off pretty fast. Cesium-137 has a 30-year half-life, just like strontium-90, and it takes a long time for that level to drop off.
And another important point to note is the longer the half-life, the less radioactive the substance is. So uranium has a 5 billion year half-life. Does that mean it's really dangerous? Actually, it means it's not very dangerous at all. I can hold uranium in my hand. If I eat it, I'm going to get metal poisoning, not radiation. But when you have shorter half-lives, if it's an 8-day half-life, that means the atoms are, in 8 days, half of those atoms will have emitted their radiation, and typically they become stable after they emit one radiation. So the shorter the half-life, the more dangerous it is, and most of the risk is in the beginning with the iodine, and then with the cesium, strontium, and then by the time you get maybe 30, 60, 90 years out, it's much, much less risk than it is today. It's not something that like it builds up in your body, and think of it more like there's atoms. These atoms are very unhappy, and at some point they're going to emit a radiation and become stable. So when they do that, by emitting the radiation, they become no longer dangerous after they've emitted it.
Do you think the radiation effect on the roofs was more of an issue, or the fact that they were probably lugging along 80 pounds worth of lead apron trying to run up the stairs, and wearing clothing that was probably warm enough to keep them warm in Siberia? Was that more of an issue on the roof than experiencing the radiation?
Well, I'm not sure that any lead would have helped them. Actually, the guys that were in there for 90 seconds, I mean, I do believe you had to run in there because the radiations are so high. You wouldn't want anyone exposed for longer than X number of seconds, and then what they calculated to be is 90 seconds. Okay, I buy that. But I would say that what you'd want to do is you want to make them as lightweight as possible. You'd want to certainly shield them from any direct, what we call beta gamma contamination, which can burn the skin. But after that, any amount of lead that you put on them, the lead is such minimal value when you're talking about thin sheets at that kind of levels, that I think they would be more encumbered by all that stuff that they ended up having. I mean, they showed in the movie, they had these like lead things up here on the top of their head, as if the radiation was raining down on them from high on, and as if your head would need protection. Your head is one of your, actually, your noggin is pretty strong with respect to radiation. It's your eyes that are probably the most sensitive. And you didn't put lead cups over their eyes, so it's kind of an interesting thing. Right? I mean, I don't think you could do that. That's what I'm saying. As you suggested, I do believe that if you try to shield somebody like that, you're probably encumbering more onto them and the after effects than if you lighten their load.
The heavy breathing and the getting dizzy and falling down on the roof is theatrical more than...
No, I mean, you could imagine the tension that those guys had. I could see them falling, tripping, being scared and just not being able to think. I could see that happening very easily. You're telling people, get up there, you got 90 seconds. It's the most important 90 seconds of your life, because if it's more than 90 seconds, it's your life, right? I can see that happening. Yeah. So, and the idea that the guy had a boot tear, right? As if that meant something. Okay, that meant he probably got a little,
It's not like
burn on his toe.
91 seconds, you're gonna die. Like, this is statistical. They do this a lot with radon meters, that you'll go into your house and like the meter reads 4 like micro rem per hour, and you're like, oh, I'm under the limit of 5, I'm perfectly fine. And then someone else goes in their house and says, oh, mine reads 5.1, I'm over the limit, my house is contaminated. No, that's not how it works. It's not a switch that's on off. It's more of a continuous, like, you have a little bit more risk, a little bit more risk, a little bit more risk for every second that you're up there. So if you were up there for 100 seconds or 120 seconds, it's not like that's guaranteed death.
Well, we know, what did they say in the movie? There's 3,000 soldiers cycled through the roof clearing or something like that over the time. They all live. I mean, they all survive. They all thrive the rest of their lives. We know, I don't know if we know if any of those guys got sick in a way that basically kind of, I mean, the vast majority of all the workers in those subsequent months.
And you saw that
Even with some car affiliation.
And we watched the CIA briefing to Ronald Reagan before. Their estimate was 200, and then that we know was down to 30, 36 or so, and indeterminate is the UN SCEAR estimate after that. So indeterminate number of deaths after the initial more fatalities later.
One of the problems that we have with making this, having a good discussion and to remove the fear about radiation and its effects, is that there's a clear linkage between certain levels of radiation and cancer. That's not arguable. And so when people think about radiation, that linkage is really strong in their minds. But we also ought to realize that about 20 to 25%, let's just talk about United States statistics, 20 to 25% of all deaths are from cancer. And so when you talk about what is the additive amount of cancer that it's causing, when you're thinking about, when you have thousands of deaths per year in cancer, is any one of them, can you point to any reason why any one of them had that cancer? And the answer is it's really hard. Statistically, it's nearly impossible. It's impossible to do. And so you have to have a whole cohort. If you really wanted to go study this at those kinds of low levels, you would have to have, samples of millions of people, which we really don't do. And we can't necessarily do tests on people this way. So part of the problem in this argument is it's down in the weeds. It's one of those things that are just so low, it's challenging to come out and say, okay, here's what the math says. I mean, we can say what the math says. The math says the risk is very small. But to try to tell that to people, to convince them of that with scientific experiments is a little harder to do. We do it with rats, but not with humans.
So I want to end our show, our program here on a high note. And so if Chris, if you and Reid would like to discuss what's the future. Like, Reid, you had some experience in the lab at TerraPower, and Chris, you had some connection, at least maybe tangential, but a connection with the micro-reactors being developed for Northern Canada and the UK. So I'm excited to hear about where are we going, and we're already decades beyond Chernobyl, it's decades beyond the Hindenburg, except sometimes we make a mistake here and there. But yeah, so we're today very safe, and in the future, how much better is it, or what's the new kind of technology?
One of the things I've been working on over the last several years is this concept called the molten salt reactor. It's one of the next generation concepts out there. And the reason why that has a fascination to me is the idea of what I call the tyranny of 100 degrees C. When you have water in any system and it starts to boil, the pressure goes up, and it also is the thing that carries away all these radionuclides into the air. So if you look at the Fukushima crisis, if there was no water, right? Let's just say we had a reactor with no water, there wouldn't have been any of those radionuclides that transferred out into the atmosphere and got distributed across the land. If there was no water, there would have been no pressure. If there was no pressure, it would have been easier to put cooling into the system. And so if you could design your reactor so that you can remove that pressure, then you can make it a lot safer from the public standpoint, if you can reduce that. And what a molten salt reactor does is it takes salt, I mentioned NaCl before, salt. If you could take that as, say, a uranium salt equivalent, which looks like table salt, a little greenish, and you melt it, so now it's operating at a very high temperature, but at no pressure. So our fuel then becomes a no pressure fuel. And in my mind, if you can get our reactors to operate at no pressure, then even if you did have some kind of disaster, there's nothing to carry it into the atmosphere. There's nothing to take it into the people space. And if we can have our reactors like that, then that was my goal, and that's one of the nice things about a molten salt reactor that brings. And so that's something I've been working on for a while. My most recent stint was at TerraPower. We had a little project on that.
I'll start with just an analogy, and imagine you're at the turn of the 20th century, back in about 1900, and one house on the street, it's the first house to have electric power. And they turn on the lights, and the next day the house burns down because it was wired improperly. The first generation you have issues with, you learn about. If you've ever owned a car and you get the first model of a certain type, you know that there's going to be issues with it. And all of the reactors we've seen, the RBNK, they're generation 1 or generation 2 reactors. They were designed with slide rules. They had to have whole teams of people trying to do math to get any number out of it. They had to make prototypes, physical prototypes, to test to see if the physics worked the way they thought. fast forward to today, and it's gotten so much easier to analyze and understand and evaluate and eliminate these design flaws. The simple fact that we have a computer means that I can run calculations and I can do these things and I can show, hey, there's no positive void worth. The temperature coefficient, we keep talking about coefficients. That means when a reactor, you always want to design a reactor so that if something happens like you have an increase in temperature, you want it to decrease in reactivity. You want it to kind of slow down the reaction. So the molten salt reactor accomplishes that in one way through thermal expansion. It's a liquid, so it expands, and the reactor tends to shut down in that case. The reactor type that I work on is actually a high-temperature gas reactor. And in these reactors, one of the benefits is that you can go to extremely high temperatures. You can go to, we operate our reactor in the 650 degrees C range, but the accident range is more like 1800 degrees C, so that we have 1,000 degrees practically of margin in our system. And that means that all we have to show is, hey, we have a coefficient that as the temperature rises, either thermal expansion or something called Doppler feedback, those are feedbacks that we can analyze, they cause the reaction to decrease. So if something happens like a pipe burst and all of a sudden we lose pressure in our system, we can go to the regulator and say, hey, we've analyzed this scenario, we can cool the reactor because instead of, as you've seen with the water reactors, they have this issue of once you get hot enough, the water boils away, and then there's nothing to cool your reactor. But with a high temperature gas reactor, if you can go to much higher temperatures, it's easier to remove heat if you've got this delta T that is much higher. So different reactors accomplish this in different ways. Molten salt, high temperature gas reactor, there's sodium reactors, there's lead reactors, there's all kinds of reactors, but the bottom line is we know a lot more about it. And another big thing is material science. My company specializes in what's called a carbide fuel. And a carbide is really good at when you hit it with a lot of radiation, it stays stable. It doesn't crack, it doesn't shred, it doesn't have a lot of the mechanisms that we see in other nuclear fuels. So in this type of fuel, we have little tiny BB-sized pieces of uranium inside of this matrix, basically what we call a compact, which is a solid block of silicon carbide. And the silicon carbide doesn't let anything diffuse through it. It's very good at keeping the fission products inside of it. So it's actually very similar to tank armor. If you go and get tank armor on certain tanks, they're also using silicon carbide. So the material science that we can do is so much better than what they could do in 1950 and 1960. So I'll send you back to the analogy that in 100 years from now, I hope that in the same way that electricity powers our home, that nuclear energy will be a key part of our energy mixture.
So I think we are pretty well into the ending time. So thank you all very much for coming. I put just a few flyers out and paid off. So.
All right. Thanks, Carl.
Did anyone originally see this event on Facebook? Okay, one on Facebook? Two, well, you were already following. You saw an ad? Okay. What you saw on the
Street.
Oh, in the street. Excellent. And you saw.
I think it was either Reddit or Eventbrite.
Okay, probably.
Yeah. Eventbrite.
Okay.
AT&T might have done that for you.
Oh, excellent. Good. Very nice. Cool.
And also the stranger.
Yeah. So again, please visit us, Friends of Fission. There's a local nuclear energy company, Energy Northwest. They produce all zero emissions energy, whether that's nuclear, solar, and wind. I think we're going to have a large panel event sometime this year, sponsored by Energy Northwest, and we're going to try to get, I won't say who yet, but we're going to try to get someone who is very well known in the nuclear community, one of several possibilities. And we hope to see you back then, sometime later this year. So we're going to have a very nice event going on. Thanks. And I'll cut our